Well, the GAO and the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense have both made numerous recommendations over the years that could improve our biosecurity posture here in the United States. So I'd like to ask my first question to Mr. Curry and then to Dr. George. If each of you could give me and the committee your number one recommendation that remains open for the DHS from your organizations that will better prepare our nation to detect and respond to biological threats. If you'd give us that number one recommendation and why it is your number one recommendation and why we should deal with it urgently. Mr. Curry, we'll start with you, and then Dr. George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right now, 2 years after the pandemic started, I think the number one recommendation is about following up on the lessons learned and the after actions from COVID. I mentioned this in the opening statement. Before COVID, the problem is we had a lot of these gaps identified and these actions identified, but we didn't really have a mechanism of accountability to figure out who was supposed to close them and any follow-up to see whether they were closed. And if we don't do that after COVID, then it's just the lessons learned are going to be an absolute waste. So I think for me right now, that is the number one thing we need to focus on. And whatever actions those might be, not just at the agency level, there could be new legislation, new roles and responsibilities identified and clarified as well, and that would require the help of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. Dr. George?
Mr. Chairman, because you asked about the recommendations that we've already made as opposed to other recommendations that we might make, then I will tell you that our number one recommendation is to shut down the BioWatch and BD21 programs and replace those programs with useful technology that actually works. I want you to know that our commission went and looked at other technologies. These technologies exist. They're in use by other departments and agencies. And in fact, the CWMD office has engaged with some of those other departments and agencies to develop some of this technology, but has not asked them to perhaps modify some of that technology for use in terms of biodetection. But there's no reason to keep this just limping along the way it is. We should shut down that program and replace it with viable technology.
Well, authorization for the CWMD office was going to expire in 2023 unless Congress takes some sort of action. Before reauthorizing this office, this committee is going to have to consider whether its current structure allows DHS to effectively prepare for and combat potential biosecurity threats. This includes examining whether aspects of the office should be moved to other parts of DHS, such as the Chief Medical Officer, to ensure that it can effectively carry out its mission. So, Dr. George, a question for you again is, if the CWMD office is given more time, if it's given tools and resources to develop a comprehensive strategy to combat biosecurity threats, do you believe that would address the challenges that this office challenges? Or, in the alternative, would it be more effective for this committee to revisit the decision to consolidate the Office of Health Affairs and the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the committee should revisit this decision. The consolidation of the department's nuclear detection capabilities, biodetection capabilities, chemical detection capabilities, and a slew of other WMD-oriented related activities in this one office it just simply hasn't worked out particularly well. There were a lot of decisions that were made that were actually not addressed by statute or legislation. The legislation just asks that where you read nuclear in the statute having to do with the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, that should also mean reading chemical and biological. That's too inadequate, and you should know that none of the committees on the House side and none of the committees on the Senate side actually took up that legislation and talked about it. There's no bill report to go with it. Therefore, there's no guidance for the Department of Homeland Security to really understand where Congress was trying to go with it. I would absolutely recommend taking a look at the various elements of this office, and I would send all of those elements right back to the rest of the department, down to the operational components and over to other parts of the headquarters elements. The port monitors, for example, should go to the people who are securing the ports, CBP and Coast Guard. If you want to keep the BioWatch detectors after replacing them with better technology, then you should send those to the Secret Service that handles national special security events, and to perhaps to CISA, because they're in charge of critical infrastructure, and that's where we're putting these detectors. The material threat determinations that are conducted by the department are, for the most part, conducted by the Science and Technology Directorate. They don't need CWMD managing S&T and a little bit of I&A to get those done. I could go on, but you see where I'm going. I think that if you did that and you returned the intelligence element, the WMD intelligence people were taken out of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis and sent over to this WMD office. I think if you return these things to where they started from and send them to where it makes sense to have those assets, I think you'll have a stronger department and a stronger biodefense program at the department than what we have right now.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a very comprehensive answer. I appreciate that. Dr. Parker, in your opinion, where should the Chief Medical Officer reside within the Department of Homeland Security?
Well, thank you. And actually, in my written testimony, I do have a description about the early days of the establishment of the Chief Medical Officer, and I think it gives you some maybe background of why initially it was established close to the Secretary. And it was established in that time when we were very much more urgently concerned about the bioterrorism threat, and we should be more concerned about that today, as has already been discussed. But Hurricane Katrina happened, and there was certainly a realization that almost every disaster, natural or intentional, that the department's going to face is going to have a huge medical public health implication. And the Secretary needed to have somebody close to the Secretary's position to advise on the medical public health implications of an intentional or natural disaster. And so I firmly believe that what transpired back in the day when I was directly at DHS and HHS is where the Chief Medical Officer ought to be today. You know, I think in a policy advisory role, I think there's no reason to encumber, say, the Chief Medical Office with an acquisition program. So it's really, you think about some of the models in the Department of Defense with, say, you know, Assistant Secretary for Health Affairs. Now, they have to run the healthcare system, but it's also an advisor to the Secretary on all the implications across the services when it comes to health and just health and medicine and public health. So I think there's a similar model that looking at the way DOD does it, and the way I think it would be very helpful for DHS, and I think would be a big assistance to the Secretary.
Well, thank you.